Why do so many people change environments, jobs, or cities and still face the same conflicts? They change jobs, but the feeling of frustration returns. They change relationships, but the arguments seem to follow the same script. They move to another country, but the same inner restlessness remains. It's as if something doesn't change, even when everything around them appears different. At first glance, this may seem like a coincidence, random chance, or maybe a psychological pattern. But there's a very specific reason why this happens. There's a hidden mechanism, a deeper logic that connects every life experience to something internal and often invisible. It's directly related to what truly shapes reality, but unfortunately, it's exactly what many people avoid facing. There is a principle that helps us understand clearly why reality seems stuck in time, why certain repetitions don't fade no matter how hard we try, and why so many different paths end up leading to the same internal destinations. This is the mirror principle. This principle is simple in form but profound in operation. According to it, reality is a mirror that reflects not only your appearance, but your frequency, your inner state, your relationship with yourself and with reality itself. What you feel every day, what you unconsciously believe, what you silently carry. That's what gets projected. The reality you see is an exact reading of what's energetically sustained within you, even if unconsciously. Many try to change reality by confronting the effects, but few realize that the reflection doesn't change because the source remains the same. It's like trying to change what the mirror shows without changing what's standing in front of it. The mirror principle isn't just a spiritual metaphor. It's one of the oldest, and perhaps least understood, keys to how consciousness shapes experience. It doesn't create reality. It only responds. It doesn't make decisions. It simply reflects. And the more you ignore what's being reflected, the more intense the repetition becomes. Because reality, under this principle, isn't interested in pleasing, it's interested in revealing. So before seeking transformation, it's necessary to honestly look at what's being reflected right now and understand why certain reflections persist, why certain situations repeat, and why, even when you change direction, it feels like you end up in the same place. The answer isn't in the world, it's in the reflection, and that's where we begin. The reality we live is not a random sequence of events, nor the product of external forces acting beyond our reach. What many call fate, coincidence, or luck is actually a structured form of response. And this response originates from something few people investigate: the internal state. According to the mirror principle, reality functions as a responsive surface, precisely reflecting the relationship we maintain with ourselves and the world. It doesn't invent situations on its own. It doesn't create obstacles or hand out rewards based on merit or luck. It only mirrors what is being sustained within us, emotionally, mentally, and energetically. This is where many get confused, because common sense teaches that external events are the cause, and our emotional state is the consequence. In other words, we believe we feel angry because of someone else, we feel sad because of a loss, or we're happy because something good happened. But if you look more deeply, you'll realize that this is just the most visible part of the cycle. The real sequence is the opposite. It's the internal state that first creates the field for certain events to occur. Emotion is not a response to what happens. In many cases, it's the seed of what's about to happen. When we repeatedly sustain an emotional frequency, such as anxiety, frustration, fear, or insecurity, that frequency starts to act as a command signal. It organizes patterns, filters perceptions, and activates specific responses from the environment. And this doesn't happen because some mystical force is trying to test us, but because external reality, in the mirror model, has no autonomy. It depends on what is being projected. Your inner state is the parameter that defines the kind of reality you experience. The way you interpret your experiences, the type of thoughts you silently repeat, and even the emotional energy that stays active when you're not speaking. All of this is translated into events that seem to come from outside but are actually returning as a response. The mirror principle shows us that reality is a field of reflection, not a stage for punishment or reward. It reflects not only what you think, but what you consistently believe. The difference between thinking something is possible and genuinely believing it, that's what defines what is reflected back. That's why it's not enough to wish for a new life. You must sustain a new frequency. Because your reality, what you live every day, doesn't respond to your occasional desires, but to what you hold as a constant truth, even if unconsciously. And here we reach a central point. Most people try to create their own reality based on conscious thoughts, but without changing the emotional baseline that supports the old version of reality. And as long as that doesn't change, the mirror simply repeats, and often it repeats even more intensely, just continuing the dominant reflection. It's like a cycle that strengthens with every return, not out of malice, but out of vibrational consistency. Because, in the end, reality reflects what is rooted, not what is being attempted. If all of this sounds rigid, it's because we're still only looking at the surface of the mirror. When you begin to understand how it operates, it becomes possible to adjust the reflection without having to force the external world to cooperate. But to do that, you need to clearly see the structure sustaining the reflection, and how it forms without us even noticing. This leads us to the next inevitable question. If reality is a reflection of the internal state, what exactly is being reflected? What reality responds to is something much deeper, an internal structure made up of beliefs, recurring emotional patterns, and automatic interpretations that have been consolidated over time. This structure functions like a dominant frequency, often unconscious, that becomes the baseline parameter for what gets mirrored back. That's why so many people say they want one thing, yet experience the exact opposite. They want abundance but reflect scarcity. They want peace but live through conflict. They seek recognition but constantly feel rejected. This happens because conscious desire is not what determines the reflection. What determines it is the content that's most deeply embedded, what you feel as truth, even when you're not trying to feel anything at all. This internal structure is mostly formed through repetition of thoughts that become narratives, repetition of emotions that become habitual states, repetition of experiences interpreted in similar ways, which solidify belief patterns. Each of these repetitions strengthens the code that the mirror of reality uses as a reference. For example, two people might think about money, but one feels fear, insecurity, and guilt. The other feels lightness, capability, and worthiness. Both think about money, but reality will reflect very different experiences for each, because the mirror responds to the dominant emotional frequency associated with the theme, not the idea itself. Here, we touch a crucial point. Reality responds to the emotional content that has become familiar within you. And this sustaining force is not rational. It's automatic. It shows up in the background of the decisions we make, in the words we choose, in the way we react without thinking. It shows up in the inner tone we use when we speak to ourselves. And all of that, combined, shapes the invisible structure that commands the outer reflection. What we call the world out there is, to a great extent, a structured response to the internal state that is repeated every day, often without us even realizing. That's why, even with effort, discipline, or focus, many people keep encountering the same outcomes, because the reflection doesn't change through the force of action. It changes with the transformation of the structure that sustains the reflection. And that structure only becomes visible through conscious observation, not through judgment, through clarity, not guilt. And it's at this point that we begin to realize the obstacle isn't in the mirror. It's in the image that's been automated inside the one observing it. Even when this internal image becomes clear, many still try to fix the discomfort by changing the external, changing people, locations, situations, but the reflection remains. And the question becomes, why does the reflection stay the same, even when everything around me has changed? When you understand that reality is a response to the internal state, not an autonomous agent imposing random experiences, a truth is revealed. The way we live isn't defined only by the world, but by the way we see ourselves inside of it. The mirror principle reveals more than just external circumstances. It reveals how we treat ourselves. Our reality is often an extension of how we deal with our emotions, decisions, and identity. It mirrors, with precision, the quality of our relationship with ourselves. And this happens silently, but repeatedly. People who don't feel valued tend to live experiences in which they are ignored or dismissed. Those who doubt their own abilities often encounter situations where they're challenged, discredited, or rejected. Not because the world is against them, but because the mirror of reality can only reflect what was projected, even without conscious intent. This reflection is subtle. It appears in patterns of repetition, in situations that return, in feelings that don't change, and most of all, in how we perceive ourselves in relation to life. That's why changing the scenery is not enough, because the reflection isn't generated by the place you're in. It's generated by the state you're in. You can move to a different city, change jobs, or shift social circles, but if your inner relationship stays the same, the results will still be just new variations of the same reflection. For example, have you ever felt like no matter where you go, certain feelings follow you? That's because the mirror doesn't respond to external movement. It responds to internal consistency. And if that consistency is marked by self-sabotage, fear, or guilt, that's what will be reflected, regardless of the context. This is the diagnosis many people avoid, because it requires an honest look, not at the events themselves, but at what's sustaining those events from within. It requires observing your own thoughts, not as truths, but as programming, feeling your own emotions not as consequences, but as indicators of what you're emitting. But this diagnosis is essential. Without it, every attempt at transformation becomes just a surface-level change. Reality might seem different for a while, but the pattern returns, because what was creating the reflection hasn't been altered, only distracted. In other words, while the internal relationship remains unchanged, the reflection persists. And this is exactly why so many change processes seem to fail. Because even though external movement happens, the internal content continues to sustain the same vibrational information. And since reality only responds, it repeats, until something real changes within the observer. But upon noticing this repetition, many people conclude that the problem lies in the circumstances. So they start once again trying to change the scenario, the people, the plans. The illusion that the external world needs to be adjusted in order for well-being to happen repeats itself like a cycle. But if the reflection keeps returning, perhaps the answer isn't in yet another external change, but in understanding why the mirror has never stopped showing the same image. It's common to think that the solution to life's conflicts lies in a new plan, a new environment, or a new person. This belief creates a constant impulse for movement, switching paths, starting over, changing on the outside what's uncomfortable on the inside. But there's a trap in this pattern because many of these changes happen without touching the root of the problem. When transformation focuses exclusively on the external, it may provide temporary relief, but it rarely leads to lasting change, because what's being mirrored in reality responds to the consistency of the internal state behind the choices. And if that state doesn't change, the new setting simply repeats the same story, with different characters and scenery. That's where the mirror principle shows its power. It reveals that reality doesn't change because you try something different. It changes because you become someone different in the process. If your relationship with yourself remains based on insecurity, fear, or unworthiness, it doesn't matter how innovative the decision is. The reflection will continue to follow the same mold. The most common mistake is believing that it's enough to act differently in order to receive something different. But action alone doesn't transform what's sustaining the reflection. True change doesn't lie in the isolated action. It lies in the internal content that gives rise to it. And while that content remains unaltered, reality continues to obey the same pattern of response. That's why many people dedicate themselves intensely, apply techniques, adopt new habits, and yet, shortly after, feel the same blocks. Because the visible layer of change was activated, but the emotional and vibrational foundation remained untouched. Have you ever felt like you were doing everything right and still nothing was really moving? That's a clear sign the mirror is still reflecting the previous version, simply out of loyalty to what's still present inside. Reality doesn't resist change. It simply requires coherence. And coherence, in this case, means that internal transformation needs to be real, stable, and dominant in order to be reflected outward. The big challenge is that many times there's a huge effort to change behavior, but very little attention paid to observing the internal state that originated that behavior in the first place. The gesture changes, but not the intention. The tone changes, but not the feeling. The path changes, but not the fear driving the movement. And that's precisely why reality doesn't respond. That's where many people get frustrated. They feel like they're trying, doing, searching, but reality keeps ignoring them. And this feeling of being ignored is actually just the mirror reaffirming what we still feel about ourselves, because that's what's being projected. For external change to have real power, it must be accompanied by an internal shift that sustains a new vibration as its base. Otherwise, the change becomes just a temporary disguise. And the mirror reveals the truth the moment the attempt at control dissolves. So if the reflection keeps coming back, even after so many attempts, maybe the problem isn't in the effort, the technique, or the decisions. Maybe it lies in the emotional frequency that continues to be the point of origin for everything being reflected. And it's precisely this frequency that needs to be understood before any real transformation can take place. This dominant frequency is not what you occasionally feel. It's what you feel most consistently. It's not the emotion of the moment, but the background tone of your inner experience. That silent feeling that accompanies your days even when you're not paying attention. And this stable vibration becomes the true emission point for the mirror of reality. If the dominant emotion is lack, reality will tend to present situations that reinforce that lack. If your most frequent emotional state is tension, the world will reflect circumstances that maintain that same state. All of this happens purely through energetic coherence. In this model, reality acts like a responsive field, and that response is not intellectual nor moral. It's vibrational. It reflects what you sustain, even if what you wish for is something else. That's why many people mentally affirm that they're ready for a new phase but continue experiencing the same limitations. Because as long as the emotion associated with the old reality is still active, the reflection won't change. Have you ever felt like you were making the right decisions, yet carrying an inner feeling that everything would go wrong? That incongruence between intention and vibration is enough to interrupt the change process. Because in the end, it's not just the intention that commands the reflection, it's the frequency. And it's important to understand that this dominant emotional frequency isn't formed overnight. It's built through repetition. Repetition of thoughts, emotional reactions, and interpretations that have been reinforced over time. A misunderstood comment, a mistake magnified by shame, a painful experience left unresolved. All of this can leave emotional residue that, when repeated, becomes the base of the dominant vibration. From there, a cycle forms. The inner state emits a vibration, reality responds with a similar reflection, and that reflection feeds back into the original emotion. This is how what many call a life pattern is formed. But at its core, it's simply an emotional reflection sustained with consistency. This is where we understand why changing thoughts isn't enough. Because the mirror doesn't just respond to the content of the rational mind, it responds to the emotional field that's active in the background. That's why affirmation or visualization practices only work when they're aligned with a coherent emotion. Otherwise, they become just mental repetitions, disconnected from the real vibration. A different emotion needs to be sustained long enough to become the new background tone. Only then does the mirror begin to respond differently. But how do you change the dominant vibration when it feels so deeply rooted? How do you sustain a new frequency when everything around you still reflects the old one? These questions don't have immediate answers, but they open a crucial path for true transformation. Because it's precisely at this point of discomfort, where the reflection no longer serves and the vibration hasn't changed yet, that the space for real change is found. And it's here too that the cycle can be interrupted, but not by trying to control the reflection, rather by understanding what's sustaining the image the mirror insists on showing, and that's only possible through observation. At some point, everyone seeking change faces an unavoidable truth. As long as the observer remains the same, the reflection cannot change. This is where the most important point of the mirror principle is revealed. Many people try to manipulate the reflection. They work tirelessly to alter outcomes, improve relationships, fix situations, or achieve what they desire. But all of that occurs on the external level, and that's why it usually fails. The change never begins with the mirror. It begins with the one looking into it. Changing the observer doesn't just mean thinking differently. It means altering the point of origin from which you perceive, feel, and interpret the world. It means dissolving automatic stories, challenging old conditioning, and, above all, reconfiguring the relationship you have with yourself. The way you treat yourself internally is the root of everything that manifests outside. This internal change doesn't have to be drastic, but it does need to be authentic. It's the gradual shifting of your dominant frequency, the replacement of a deeply rooted vibration with another that's more aligned with what you truly want to reflect. It's the decision not just to want a new life, but to become a new version of yourself, from the inside out. When you begin to position yourself differently on the inside, reality begins to change in subtle details. These small signs are indications that the mirror is beginning to register something new. They are early responses to a shift that is still gaining strength. But they only appear when the observer stops trying to control the reflection and instead turns attention toward what the reflection is revealing. Breaking the cycle isn't about doing more. It's about looking inward and rewriting, with presence and honesty, the internal narrative that is currently sustaining the reflection. And that doesn't require perfection, only consistency. But this internal transition is often uncomfortable, because in changing the observer, old identities must be left behind. The image you held about who you were and what the world was begins to dissolve, and that can bring doubt, insecurity, or resistance. After all, the old reflection was predictable, even if it wasn't satisfying. But real change requires embracing the unknown. Still, This is the path to transforming reality without fighting it. Because when you truly change, the reflection no longer needs to be forced. It naturally follows the new image. And it's at this point that a new perspective emerges. Because by understanding the mirror as a response, not a cause, the focus of transformation shifts entirely. Life stops being something that needs to be fixed and becomes something that can be realigned. It's not about stating what you want. It's about living emotionally as if that reality is already being reflected. And that requires, above all else, a silent and continuous change in the observer. The first key here is recognizing the dominant pattern. After all, before you can replace it, you have to see it clearly. Identify which feeling has been accompanying your days, what interpretations keep repeating, what emotional state you've come to consider normal, but that's actually sustaining your current reality. This observation must happen without judgment, because the goal isn't to resist what exists, but to understand why it's being reflected. And from there, yes, you can begin a process of vibrational reconstruction. That's where the second step begins, consciously introducing a new emotional frequency, even in small doses. This doesn't mean pretending that everything is fine or forcing yourself to feel something that isn't authentic. It means, in practice, allowing different sensations to gradually enter your daily life. A memory that brings lightness, a moment of silence that brings presence, an internal choice to interpret events with more spaciousness and less resistance. This is vibration being adjusted. Have you ever felt gratitude for something simple, and just moments later, notice that your perception of the world had already changed? That's the immediate effect of a vibrational shift, small but real. And the secret is turning that into a regular practice, not as a method to control reality, but as an exercise in emotional re-education. Throughout the day, you can ask yourself, what is my vibration reflecting right now? That simple question helps bring awareness to your dominant internal state. And from that awareness, you can then choose, intentionally, what to keep and what needs adjustment. A helpful tool in this process is what we can call a confirmation log. It works like this. At the end of the day, choose an affirmation that represents the new reality you want to reflect, and look for evidence, even in the smallest details, that it's already being built. For example, if the new desired vibration is security, and your affirmation is, "I am becoming more emotionally stable," then look for situations, even small ones, where you responded with more balance than before. Write them down. Acknowledge them. Give that signal more strength. This practice isn't meant to convince the rational mind. It's meant to reprogram the emotional field that sustains the reflection. Over time, small confirmations add up, and they build the base of a new dominant frequency. And throughout this process, there's one fundamental reminder. The mirror doesn't change when you fight it. It changes when you change what's standing in front of it. It's not about crafting a perfect image. It's about consistently and authentically sustaining an inner version that is more aligned with the life you actually want to experience. The reflection won't arrive on the first day, but it will arrive, because the mirror always responds. And when you stop trying to manipulate the world and begin working with integrity on your internal state, the world begins to cooperate. Not as a reward, but as a reflection. And in that moment, everything changes direction. When change starts happening from the inside out, something very particular is revealed. The world no longer feels as resistant as it once did. What previously required effort starts to move with more fluidity. Situations that once felt stuck begin to open. People who used to trigger conflict either drift away naturally or start to behave differently. The external environment begins to reorganize itself, not through manipulation, but through resonance. This is the point at which the mirror principle is truly understood as a real model of how consciousness interacts with experience. And that understanding completely changes the way we relate to life. Because from this new perspective, every event is no longer seen as an obstacle, but as a mirror. Each experience becomes a kind of message. Reality starts to show more clearly which parts of you are still active, even if you're no longer consciously aware of them. This type of reading doesn't require judgment. It requires presence, a deeper listening, a quieter gaze to interpret what is being returned to you as a scene, a behavior, or a result. It's a shift from reaction to observation. And it's in this shift that consciousness expands. Have you ever noticed that certain external situations stopped happening when you simply stopped reacting to them in the same way? That's no coincidence. It's the reflection changing in response to a new internal posture. The mirror always delivers the form, but you are the one who provides the content. This new way of seeing the world also dissolves the old idea that life must be fixed before happiness can begin. The focus shifts from trying to control the external to realigning the internal, because it becomes clear that it's not about controlling what happens, but about understanding who is happening behind the events. And that's when the mirror becomes more than a tool for observation. It becomes a tool for self-knowledge. Through it, you begin to notice aspects of yourself that were hidden beneath automation. You begin to see patterns that had previously gone unnoticed. You begin to understand that every external manifestation has an origin point, and that point is your internal state, repeated, sustained, and unquestioned. Over time, this awareness creates a different relationship with reality, and even when circumstances aren't pleasant, they stop being interpreted as punishment. They start being seen as useful reflections, showing you where your frequency is still out of alignment. Of course, this doesn't eliminate life's challenges. Life will always present contrast. But now, there is a real tool to navigate those moments. And once this is understood, the power of transformation returns to the hands of the observer. Thank you for embarking on this journey with me. If this video resonated with you, I invite you to like and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with others so they can benefit from this message. And don't forget to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, reflections, and experiences. Thanks again for watching and for joining me. Take care and see you soon.